So let's turn now to the economy, which was the central focus of the third plenum. And so, Dan, most of those 17,700 words were about economic policy. Now, you've been deeply concerned about the economy, suggesting that China faces endemic structural problems, that deep reforms are needed to revive the economy's fortunes. Did you get what you were hoping for?
Thanks, Scott. Well, it's not just my analysis, right? It's in party documents as well, that the economy is unbalanced and growth has all these issues. And it's in everything we've learned over the past 200 years about macroeconomics, that when countries get through the early development phase and get to $12,000, $13,000 per capita middle income levels, right? The kind of policies that are needed to sustain whatever growth is possible at a lower rate, at a more wealthier point, right? The policies need to change. And so I'm, observing this the same way everybody else is, and asking whether the party's coming up with the goods. Coming into this plenum, and the third plenum in the cycle of plenums is always meant to be the one dealing with the big structural questions of the times, right? My colleagues and I had three criteria that we were looking for over the past couple months as we got ready for this. The first was the quality of the diagnosis of the economic challenges. If you don't diagnose correctly what you're dealing with, then you can't move on to figure out what to do about it, right? And there has been a lot missing in the party's self-description of what ails the economic system. Some would call it denial. Some would say that the style and culture is to have a braver face and not, accentuate the negative, et cetera. But in the big structural once every 5 years event, we needed to see clarity in the diagnosis of what was going on here, because clearly the party's been surprised since the end of COVID that growth has not recovered more than it has, right? So that's quite evident, I think, to everyone. Secondly, the concreteness of the proposed policy actions in the decisions document to address those challenges once they are diagnosed. And there's we're going to be talking a lot about, some people will say, well, the plenum document is not where you'd expect to see, details on specific policies. That's not correct. The most impactful third plenum outcomes in China's modern history, 1978, and I dare say in Xi Jinping's era in 2013, were chock-a-block with very concrete to-do list on what to do to address conditions. And then thirdly, we're looking for coherence, because with something like, at least 60 subordinate clauses in this document, right? It is another 60 decisions as the 2013 document was, right? We've got a lot here, and we have to ask the question, is everything rowing together in the same direction, or do we have a push me, pull you policy package that goes in different directions? For us, the acid test, today is the day when we see the results of the acid test. It is, are we going to be talking about how much productivity is likely to come up as a result of this policy package? Or are we going to mostly be talking about whether anything we see in this document isn't just a regurgitation of what was said in the past? Our verdict is that we're disappointed. And by and large, everyone is just going to be talking about how much this is just a repeat of what we've seen in the past. These are promises that have already been made. There is absolutely no diagnosis of the structural nature of the economic headwinds and problems that China is encountering today. There is almost nothing concrete and specific new policy actions to be taken. It is all about the what we're going to do and want to do, and nothing about the how we're going to do it here. And there's a tremendous problem of incoherence in the package, where it's asserted that a whole new corporate system is going to be created, for example, and lots of other sweeping statements like that. But there, at the same time, is all this talk about enhancing the big state role of the state-owned enterprises, right? So how is it that you're unleashing markets where at the same time you're growing the role of state in the system? I could go through, and we will hopefully, and go into a little detail here about just how incoherent this mix of things is. So take all that together. I don't think we're gonna see any lift under the wings. And indeed, this morning, the People's Bank of China had to cut interest rates a little bit to try to create a little more lift under this thing. Whereas if this had been a good document, I think the markets would be rallying a little bit, which they did not do.
Dan, let me follow up with one specific area that the decision and the plenum focused on, which has been a focus of you all, your colleague Logan Wright, who's also a non-resident with us, and that's the fiscal system and finances. They did provide a list of things that they say that they want to achieve. End off-budget financing, unify budget allocation powers, more systematically use tax breaks as incentives, reform personal income taxes and other kinds of taxes for income related to property, finance, et cetera, reform central local fiscal relations, give more resources to localities to deal with the financial problems that they have to address. Is that the wrong direction? Is it not enough? Is it, what would be the right kind of way to discuss addressing the challenges in China's fiscal system?
Scott, you're hitting the nail on the head. The fiscal stress in the system is probably the single most acute challenge that China is facing right now, right? There are some cyclical aspects to the very low GDP growth China has had for the past 18 months, 24 months. And that is somewhat normal, especially after a global pandemic that, is a century event. But the ability of government to use fiscal wherewithal to lean against the cycle is absolutely sidelined. The conventional ways for local government to raise funds to pay for the unfunded mandates they're handed from Beijing by selling land to property developers. This is what has created China's problems, not what has been a source of countercyclical government, power to deal with economic challenges. And indeed, the document says, again, we will do center local fiscal reform. That was an urgent, high priority in 2013. In 2013, fiscal had its own subsection in the document. This time, fiscal does not even have one of the 15 subsections. It has been subsumed under another broader section. And so while the big obvious statement that we need to do fiscal reform urgently is still there, none of the clarity that is required to achieve that and get it done is there. There's a lot of talk about shifting power between center and local to deal with fiscal responsibilities. But shifting resources, it's not entirely clear to me that that's what this plenum document is going to do. It's not entirely clear to me whether the center is taking more complete responsibility for paying for local healthcare, local education, which is the biggest part of the fiscal crisis. All those crucial investments in human capital are assigned to localities, to subnational government to pay for, but they're not given the ability to finance or otherwise raise funds to cover it. And so is the center going to say, okay, the center is going to take responsibility for healthcare and for education and for environmental cleanup and a lot of other things? That is not at all clear in this document to us. I think we'll probably be continuing to pick at it and see what we can squeeze out in terms of clarity in the weeks ahead. But at first blush, it's missing a lot of the clarion elements of tax reform that the 2013 document did have. And they did start to introduce property taxes, for example, in January 2014, right after the plenum. That's not happening this time, I don't think.
Yeah. Let me offer not a rebuttal, but try an explanation and see how you respond. Because you mentioned, one of the three pillars that shapes your judgment is coherence and the lack of coherence. And I guess it would be sort of like internal consistency, right, is what you're trying to look for. And I see intellectual coherence, even if there may be differences in sort of moving ways. So, and I think, the coherence is about the statist role of the direction of economic governance, a strong role for the party in directing the economy, much less attention, even though the word market appears a lot and they talk about it, it doesn't receive the kind of sanctity statement that it did in the 13th, in 2013, where the market was supposed to, be the decisive allocator of resources. The high emphasis on high tech to achieve growth and very little attention to consumption in households. As you said, support for the public sector and state-owned enterprises, even while pledging a level playing field for private companies, and the highlighting of the need to align economic growth and national security. That all seems quite intellectually coherent, but I wonder, and I think because that's what their intention is, but maybe it's more of the same. But in 17,700 words, they are pledging to try a lot harder and focus on areas they haven't focused on. So is it less that it's incoherent and more, maybe it's the coherence of it that is more bothersome to you or to others? I'm just curious your take on that.
I don't know, Scott. Well, we'll need to continue this for a while, this part of our conversation, I think. I think along the lines that you're unspooling there, coherence would be a more complete state organized solution to China's economic problem. But I continue because I don't think anybody has discovered a way for the state to deliver high growth or as high growth as markets have done. And so we still see a sort of recourse to pointing to the market and saying the state will make sure the market does it in order to come up with the ability to say that this is going to get us to where we want to go by 2035. And we have all these targets set out in the long term in terms of how much China intends to grow. But here's my favorite line in the English translation that kind of captures this odd admixture of statism and market. Quote, "We will develop better mechanisms to ensure the contributions of production factors, labor, capital, land, knowledge, technology, management, and data are determined by the market and rewarded accordingly." Well, how is the state and the party to order the markets to be efficient in rewarding every factor of production, right? If we look at the performance of the economy, labor productivity, capital productivity, overall growth, it is inversely correlated with the reversion back to state planning that we've seen over the past decade. So somehow sticking markets are going to figure it out in this sentence without providing the connective tissue to explain how on earth and whether the party even understands how market works, I would say I don't think so when I look at this. It seems quite incoherent to me. So I'll be curious to continue the conversation with you and see whether there's a way in which this rhymes.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they're going to square that circle. If I was a private I'd be really curious what dinner tables are for private entrepreneurs who are meeting over the weekend and this week, what they're talking about, whether they feel like they've been given a new runway and lease on life, or whether they feel further squeezed. I also think foreign governments looking at this are going to be thinking that the tensions that they currently face with China aren't going to be going away anytime soon.
Yeah, let me just as a final thought, observe, right, that one of the biggest concerns for us outside of China looking at this whole package is that it essentially denies the whole thesis that there is a macroeconomic imbalance in the way China's system works that is spilling over capacity into global markets taking up space that's going to prevent any other developing country from ever moving into light manufacturing, creating politically electric battles over high-end sectors like electric vehicles, of course, and other things in Europe, the United States, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. And so this does nothing to allay those concerns that we're just looking at more escalation in external trade and investment pressures and a sort of bifurcation rather than offer an off-road to those, I think, very real and legitimate structural economic concerns.
Well, let me just give a final way to round this out, a very brief comment. I do think that the party believes it can engineer a wave of S&T innovation and reform regulatory institutions and create sufficient opportunities for domestic, private, and foreign firms and induce an economic recovery and sustained growth over the longer term. There's obviously a great deal of skepticism about that. And so I think what we're going to be watching is this really interesting battle over narratives and whether the CCP can come back someday and say, I told you so. You all didn't believe us, but we really got it right. But for the moment, it's going to be very tough for them to address domestic and international confidence, which I don't know if really was allayed at all in any way by the document that was issued. Let me hand the baton over now to my colleague Jude Blanchette, who will take things from here with a discussion of the politics of the third plenum.
If I can, Bonnie, I think you had a follow-up question for,
go ahead.
For Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Really appreciate it. You mentioned there wasn't any concrete policy recommendations or proposals coming out of the plenum. I guess a more basic question I had is, regardless of what China did or did not spell out at the plenum, what do you view as China's current approach to deal with its economic challenges? I guess as a non-economic expert, I'm struggling to put together if there are existing couple of pillars that you may identify or view as already part of China's current approach.
Ooh, Bonnie, that's a big question. It's going to take probably more time than I want to steal from Ling Ling and the discussion here. But I think we have a sort of surface veneer of what the approach is purported to be. And then we have an underlying reality behind that veneer, which is just letting a very crude and rough adjustment of people's net worth in the household sector. Like, the households are eating it. They're the ones taking the haircut. They've seen their life savings diminish in value by, say, 15 or 20% over the past 3 years, because 80% of their net worth was in property, which has gone through this extraordinary crisis, right? Likewise, the legitimate expectation of about 800 million Chinese to be able to go up the conveyor belt toward middle income, middle class status has been set back terribly by the lack of an adequate fiscal capacity in government, and also the closure of international economic opportunities. It hasn't entirely happened now, but unless you think I'm wrong about the sort of continued deterioration of expectations on the international trade and investment side, it's going to a lot of Chinese are going to lose the opportunity to participate in a sort of healthy globalization because of the unnecessarily kind of self-serving document that we see here in 2024, which takes us through 2029. It's going to be a brave new world by then. I am pretty confident of that.
Just picking up the thread here, and Ling Ling, I want to turn to you in a minute. If I can't help but to try to bridge a bit of that previous discussion, Dan and Scott, with what I want to ask Ling Ling about. But Scott, I guess I'm trying to split the difference between you and Dan, if I can split that difference even further, because I agree with you that there seems to be a somewhat coherent worldview that emerges in this in terms of Xi Jinping's conception of political economy and its admixture of constrained, birdcage economy, party leadership, state capital, and I can't help but notice with a probably an unintentional hat tip to Barry Naughton in this plenum decision that they talk about state capital being steered towards major industries in key fields vital to national security, a hat tip to Barry Naughton's steerage. But I guess, Scott, my thought was, at what point can we make adjudications about the efficacy of Xi's approach to political economy? He's been in power for nearly 12 years. And I think of is China better off now than it was 12 years ago approach, and sort of building on Dan, it strikes me that this document doesn't speak to many of the central concerns that not we Western neoliberals have about how China should run its economy, but what many Chinese economists, social scientists see are the really critical gaps that need to be addressed on fiscal, tax and fiscal system, on human capital and talent, on distribution of the fruits of growth into the Scott Rosell invisible China world. It seems to me that with all the power Xi Jinping has, there is a true rejuvenation strategy that I'm still surprised he's not focused on. Instead, and I'll just make one quick comment and then turn to Lingling, we have a whole big new section on national security in this plenum document. And it's an interesting section on national security. For one, I'm struck by the fact that 10 years into making national security a very key focus of his policy agenda, he still feels like much, much more needs to be done here. This is not just a rote resuscitation of previous concepts of national security. He's adding new things in here, like we're now going to be thinking about coordination of security in quote, neighboring regions. So we're pushing national security out of our borders. We're going to be linking national security to, quote, protection against risks to China's interests and investments overseas. This is very much a counter-containment strategy of national security. He talks about new mechanisms for countering foreign sanctions, interference, long-arm jurisdiction will need to be strengthened. So the longer Xi is in office, the more the inadequacies of the national security state he's trying to construct become, on his own terms, evident. And so I'm just struck by how much deeper the hole seems to be getting as Xi Jinping tries to dig his way out on this national security piece. That's a long throat clearing, Lingling, to turn it to you to say, I think I know how you assess this document based on comments you made before we started, but let me give you a blank slate here. I have a few targeted questions I want to ask you, but just at a high level, we all had to read this over the last 24 hours. What struck out to you? What kind of key messages do you think the Xi administration was trying to deliver with this document?
Oh, thank you, Jude. I really hope I'm not that predictable. Well, to your question, from the really bigger point I'm seeing here after having read this big document, thoroughly as everyone else has, if we ever need an official declaration of the end of Deng Xiaoping's reform era, this document would be it. So why I'm saying this is because this third plenum document made it very clear that when Xi Jinping talks of reform today, it doesn't mean economic liberalization. It doesn't mean things like giving markets and private entrepreneurs more room in China's economy. It doesn't mean relaxing the party's control over the economy. It means doubling down on command and control. I did a little bit of compare and contrast between the plenum that ended last week and the one that took place in 2013, soon after Xi Jinping came to power. So just a few a few major takeaways I want to share with all of you. First of all, both plenum, as Dan laid out, the 2013 plenum laid out roughly 15 areas, specific areas for reform. And this time it was about 14 areas. So roughly the same number of areas for reform. We all know, and some of that really was evidenced by very diligent research by Dan and Scott and some other China watchers. So we know that most of the reform efforts promised in 2013 have petered out. So that really raises the question about the credibility of the new reform efforts pledged by the leadership. The second point is that the most notable pledge made by the third plenum in 2018 involved letting the market play the decisive role in allocating resources. That pledge was downplayed in this plenum that ended last week. And instead, the leadership stressed the need for the government to guide the market. The third point is that back in 2018, the plenum also pledged to accelerate the transformation of government functions. It's a very important point because, in short, that goal back then meant that the leadership had this intention to reduce government intervention in the economy, which would be in line with the promise of deepening market reforms. But this time around, that pledge is nowhere to be found in this third plenum document. So that's further evidence that China is moving further away from market-based economies, even more so into command and control. The fourth point is that the meeting put, as you pointed out, Jude, greater emphasis on national security than the plenum in 2018. To me, it's more about political security than national security, right? When you talk about national security, what you think about is, maybe some foreign country is looking to invade China. Is that the case? Not so, right? But it's more about Xi Jinping himself wanting to centralize power and secure power, right? So that's really political security we're talking about. So greater emphasis on national security, or in my view, political security. But I want to say is that that's not to say that the economy doesn't matter to the leadership. It still matters. But Xi Jinping's goal is to build up the country's economic resilience to counter pressure from the US and other Western countries. So that means greater resources, more resources to be directed by the government into high tech and other areas seen as strategically important for the party state. The kind of industry-centered economic policy that has taken shape in recent years will continue. So basically, Xi Jinping is really staying the course of this kind of doubling down on command and control, doubling down on state-led industrial policy. So overall, my take is that yes, the leadership still talks of reform, but the meaning of reform has fundamentally changed.
Ling, if I can ask you one quick follow-up question, then I want to turn this over to Bonnie. Also on the politics front, in the plenum, we saw some personnel moves. Specifically, we saw the expulsion, not only from the Central Committee, but from the party itself, Li Shangfu and Liu Chao. Liu Chao was the head of the rocket force. Dear Comrade Qin Gang, however, was simply removed from the Central Committee and keeps his party membership. People often compare the Communist Party to the Catholic Church, and as a lapsed Catholic, I will say it strikes me then that Li Shangfu and Liu Chao committed what we would call cardinal sins, and they were therefore expelled from the party itself. Qin Gang, it appears, committed a venal sin and retains his party membership. What does the soft landing for Qin Gang indicate to you about all the various rumors about what happened? What do you make of this? How do you triangulate what the actual sin committed by Qin Gang was in light of him keeping his party membership and being referred to as comrade in that announcement as well?
Right. Obviously, we're still investigating. And it's China's politics is such a black box, it is even more so than ever before. So I don't want to make it sound like I know definitive answer here, but I wanted to share some of our existing reporting stories we already published, and also, together with some of the new analysis based on the third plenum document. So if you remember, back in September last year, the Wall Street Journal published a front page story about an internal briefing China's Communist Party did. It was in last summer. The internal briefing, the audience was to senior party bosses, provincial party bosses, and ministers. So at the internal briefing, according to sources familiar with the matter, Qin Gang was removed from the foreign minister position because of alleged lifestyle issues. As you all know, lifestyle issues is basically way, about extramarital affairs, the kind of stuff, mysteries of matters that fallen senior officials are known to have had, right, for many years. That is basically what the internal briefing said. However, back then, the internal briefing also indicated that the investigation into Qin Gang was continuing. On what? Whether or not this affair he had with Hong Kong TV presenter that was carried out during his tenure as a Chinese ambassador to Washington. So the investigation was zeroing on whether or not this affair threatened China's national security. So that was our story in September of last year. So basically there was a little bit of explanation about why he was removed from the foreign minister position with so-called lifestyle issues, but it was mostly because of this affair took place in the United States. And there was very big speculation about whether or not the affair threatened China's national security. So, okay, obviously we still do not know for sure all the details, but based on this document, Jude, as you said, it's kind of a soft landing for Qin Gang. So it indicates, the document decision on him indicates that, number one, he was not a spy. He was cleared of espionage. So that one was cleared. Number two, what was number two? Number two was that he might, still pretty serious punishment for him because, before last year, right? He was state councilor, foreign minister, such a rising star in Chinese politics, right? But now he might get a ceremonial position down the road. But overall, his high-rising political career is over. But it's not serious enough as to expel him out of the party. Whether or not the leadership will disclose the real reasons behind his removal is still questioned. My guess is that they will not, because the decision clearly stated that he resigned as if he really wanted to resign, right? So, obviously we're all still trying to figure out what exactly happened, but I think the offense was serious enough to get him removed, but not serious enough as to expel him out of the party.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. And I think that's a very good parsing of what you say is a fairly opaque situation. Bonnie, if I can turn it over to you now for some observations on what the plenum decision tells us about foreign and defense policy.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jude. And I do want to actually circle back with Ling at the end with questions, particularly about how you look at the PLA changes too, in terms of personnel. In terms of looking at what came out of the plenum related to foreign policy, I think we've already alluded to this, but I want to spell out again, is that it's pretty clear from the resolution as well as some of the other documents that came out that in terms of China's threat perceptions, right, that China faces a very grave and complex international environment. And if you look at Xi's explanation of the resolution, he was very clear in noting that right now China senses momentous changes of a magnitude not seen in a century are accelerating across the world. Regional conflicts and disturbances keep cropping up, and global issues are becoming more acute. External attempts to suppress and contain China are escalating. Exactly what Jude mentioned in terms of some of the measures or recommendations are to be able for China to counter containment. And as June mentioned, there's a specifically the document actually says that China is giving higher priority to national security, and that national security is a pivotal foundation for ensuring steady and sustained progress. I see China's recommendations for national security defense on three big buckets. Jude and Ling have already talked about two of the big buckets. The first big bucket being improving national security at home, or what Ling calls political security at home. And we've talked about recommendations to protect national security by better leveraging science and technology. But also there are other measures there that China wants to advance, including having a response support system for major public emergencies, being able to establish a unified national population management system, which I think would be useful to deal with both internal crises, disasters, but also deal with foreign contingencies that may arise, and maintaining law and order. The second bucket we also referenced, I think, both in the conversation with Dan and with Ling, is improving what I call improving foreign policy responses to security threats, including countering foreign efforts to contain China. Right, so June mentioned the mechanisms for promoting security in neighboring regions. I think Dan referenced the strengthening mechanisms for countering foreign sanctions, interference in armed jurisdictions. June mentioned the controlling trade risks. And there's, of course, also other measures to deepen law enforcement and judicial cooperation. The third bucket that we haven't discussed is what are the three recommendations they have for the PLA. The first is improving institutions and mechanisms for leading and managing the PLA, which I interpret to mean that China still has significant concern about corruption and loyalty within the PLA, in addition to how well the PLA functions and trains. The second is deepening reform for joint operation systems and deepening civil military reforms. Everything, at least in terms of what was mentioned with respect to the PLA, showcases that China still wants to invest significantly in defense spending and expand Chinese military activities. With reference to the PLA, there was also a mentioning of the goal of China continuing to achieve basic modernization of the PLA by 2027. I think it's important to flag here that this is not a new goal. It also does not mean China needs to be able to achieve military on par with the United States by 2027. It's a reiteration of a prior goal. So in other words, looking broadly at what was outlined in the third plenum regarding foreign policy and national security, there was nothing really new there aside from continuity with what China has already been doing. One other thing I will flag was that the communique also stressed China's desire for what they call a peaceful, independent foreign policy of peace. And it really promoted its global development initiative, the global security initiative, and the global civilization initiative. On the side, as the plenum was occurring, we saw on July 17 that Wang Yi released an article called Historic Steps for Peaceful Coexistence to a Shared Future for Humanity. It basically reiterated points that he had made in late June during another meeting. But in that article, he referenced Xi Jinping's 8 measures for the global South that include, for example, increased training, scholarship, and exchange opportunities. But what was interesting among Xi's recommendations was also to form more free trade agreement with the global South and China's desire to import over 8 trillion from the global South between now and 2030. Also, during the plenum on July 18th, we saw the China Institute for International Studies, a Chinese research institute administered by China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, issue a report on the evolution of the Global Security Initiative. And that report release was accompanied by a statement from Wang Yi, as well as a statement from China's Vice Minister of Foreign Minister Chen Xiaodong. And that report, I think, is worth reading in depth because it justifies and tries to explain how important China's global security initiative is. I'll just flag one thing that I found interesting. Whereas in most public discussions Wang Yi or China's foreign ministry has about major power relations, it typically prioritizes United States, Russia, and Europe. And this document, when it came to coordinating interactions between major countries, it listed strategic coordination with Russia first, then at least listed bolstering strategic trust with Europe second, and then maintaining a healthy and stable China-US relationship as third. I think that probably represents a more candid assessment from a less official Chinese, but still quite important Chinese organization on when it comes to security issues, how important Russia is to China. And I would also note that around the plenum time, we also saw China engage in 2 military exercises with Russia, both ending in the South China Sea. And that only showcases the importance of Russia to China. One last thing I'll flag on the personnel front. Jude and Lily had talked about almost all of the major personnel changes, but I'll also note that in addition to Li Shangfu and Li Yuchao, we also had the chief of staff of the rocket force, Sun Jingying, expelled from the party. And what was missing was what some had speculated, whether Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun would be added to the Central Military Commission or not. And we did not see his addition during the plenum. So with that, I have, I guess, 3 questions for Dan and Ling if we have time. So the first one I have is more general. Given the economic challenges that China has at home, how much can China fund its very ambitious foreign policy and defense agenda? Specifically, I'm very interested, Dan, from your perspective of how can China engage in such expanded free trade agreements with the global South? And do you think it's possible for China to reach Xi Jinping's goal of increasing imports from the global South to 8 trillion by 2030? I don't know how ambitious that is. And for Ling, what is your sense of what is happening on the PLA side compared to the what's happening on the foreign ministry side? You mentioned your assessment of Qinggang, but it seems to me, given all the I guess the much harsher treatment of the PLA, there seems to be a lot more distrust of the PLA. I just wanted your thoughts on what you're seeing from your reporting and your research on the PLA side of politics within China. So maybe I'll turn to Dan first.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great question. And this one really needs a balance sheet accounting sort of systematic work through in terms of whether China can follow through with all of its external side pledges, promises, policies, ambitions, right? The trade dynamics are partly a function of policy. China says it's going to import a certain amount, right? But the markets, the absorptive capacity of China's household sector, right, is the biggest determinant of whether it can do that. And let's just look at the domestic internal Chinese economic picture over the past 2 years, 3 years time. I mean, those familiar with Rhodium Group's analysis believe that GDP has been overstated in the past 2 cycles very significantly. And the biggest component of that is that household consumption is not growing the way it is reported to be growing in the system. And as we discussed, there's only so much that government consumption can do to lean into the cycle and make up for that. And so, the ability of China to absorb its own production, to import from itself, if you will, at home should be and is to some extent in urgent debate and discussion. Because if China doesn't absorb what it produces, what happens? It doesn't import. It spills that abroad as overcapacity exports, which is exactly what anybody who has their head screwed on is talking about right now. And it's been an acute problem. It's getting worse. It's not resolving itself whatsoever. And so it's one thing for Beijing to say, we're going to absorb all this production, presumably mostly commodities, right? Not even manufactured goods from the global South, which may or may not be an attractive proposition, that we're going to be a raw material supplier to the metropole for the rest of our existence if we're in the global South. I think that's not what Malaysia, where Ling Ling is today, or Brazil or Nigeria, or a lot of other countries had in mind for what their opportunities would be in the global economy. Very questionable. And then there's the development assistance contribution that China makes to the global South as well. The Belt and Road program being the signature piece of that. And the analysis we have presently is that on net, the past 3 years, the global South has been paying back debt and debt service to China, not getting on net new money in development assistance from China. And so I think it's completely debatable whether China is in a position, no matter what its aspirations are, to simply fund absorb, play this role of an engine of global demand when it's just as easy to argue that China is on track to grow 0 to 2% in 2024 than it is to say it's going to make its 5% numbers. One of the things a lot of folks in the markets were looking for in the plenum document here was some signal that Beijing intended to use the balance sheet of the central bank to finance and fund a big fiscal stimulus that would be enough to make up for the shortfall we are on track to have this year in domestic demand. And indeed, there was absolutely no indication in the plenum documents that the party and the state was prepared to use its ability to borrow more to finance that kind of fiscal stimulus.
Thank you very much, Dan. Ling, did you want to weigh in on the PLA personnel shifts and what that means in terms of looking at Beijing's relationship with the PLA?
Sure, just briefly. So if we look at Xi Jinping's 3 terms so far, right? The first term, he focused on securing his control over the PLA. So there were a lot of purges during his first term. The second term, he moved into focusing his effort on enhancing the PLA's capacity to fight. So that involved basically showering the PLA with money to improve the kind of equipment, especially they want to make sure, the equipment is made in China, right? So now going into the third term, at the very beginning, what? All those purges again? So that really raises the question of whether or not all that money, all that effort spent during his second term in terms of enhancing the PLA's capacity to fight has gone anywhere, right? However, I do believe PLA remains Xi Jinping's top priority, among Xi Jinping's top priorities, along with foreign policy and defense strategies. The economy is serving those goals. Again, as I said earlier, the goal is to build up the economy's resilience against Western sanctions. So it's all part of this, agenda by Xi Jinping. I wanted to just quickly answer a question raised by Scott earlier. He said he was wondering what Chinese entrepreneurs were talking about right after the third plenum. So I have been traveling Southeast Asia this whole month. And last week, I happened to have Baizhou with quite a few entrepreneurs from Shanghai, Sichuan, and Jilin. So they read the document and they pointed out very insightful views from them. It was like, okay, China now, as Dan laid out earlier, China now faces 3 crises. 1, property crisis. 2nd, the local government debt crisis. 3rd, a financial crisis. Yes, China does have a financial crisis right now, not among the big banks, but among the medium-sized, smaller banks. The document is a perfect opportunity for the third plenum document to have some sort of solutions targeting either one of those 3 crises that would be uplifting for markets, for investors, for businesses. None. As Dan said, 0, right? So that was a huge blow to business confidence. And one more final point, again, what Scott mentioned earlier about, how effective the leadership has been ever since late 2012 in terms of transforming China, in terms of modernizing China. Just one point I want to make here. Back in late 2012, back in 2013, global confidence in China's economy was sky high. Right? You all remember China was the place to be. Everybody has so much hope on Xi Jinping. Fast forward to today. Where is the confidence? Where is the FDI? Where is the private investment? That's your answer.
Scott, let me
you
just,
very much.
Scott, I think you had a question, or maybe even a comment about your question.
Sure, thanks. It's clear to me that the Xi Jinping and the party feel under siege. They came in 2013, 2012 with a desire to avoid color revolutions, strengthen the economy, avoid the problems of the global financial crisis that everyone else had. And as Dan has written quite clearly, the China originally tried a variety of reforms, even market-oriented reforms, and then when they ran into headwinds, they abandoned those efforts to use the market and have moved in a statist direction. And I think you add on the pandemic, the trade war, the tech war, and that sense of being under siege is greater than ever. And despite the fact that China is probably wealthier, healthier, greener, safer than it's ever been, I think it's obviously huge economic problems that they have to tackle. But at the same time, I don't think the sense of that they feel, how much they feel under siege is equivalent to actually the balance sheet of a situation that they could manage in a different way. But the question I wanted to ask is, at least in my memory, this document was the first time that I've seen them make 2029 a goal, a target to achieve anything. It's the 80th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, and it's 5 years from today. Previously, they had focused on 2035 as achieving modernization, 2049 as becoming a leading dominant S&T power, et cetera. And now they've stuck in this 2029 goal. And I was curious from a political perspective, Jude and Lingling, what this means. From a economic perspective, Dan, what this means.
Just very quickly, Scott, I was struck by that as well. Had to do some Google searching to make sure that my conclusion was the same as yours about this being a new time target. My initial reaction. So it said the entirety of the reforms outlined in the plenum have to be completed by 2029. So the first thing that comes to me is structural urgency, right? Ensuring that folks aren't taking their foot off the gas over the next decade to 2035, really ensuring that there is a way station in between now and 2035. And of course, 2035 is a way station on the way to the rejuvenation goals of 2049. But strong sense of urgency that the international environment and domestic environment demand that we put the pedal all the way to the ground. The second, and this is very cynical, I think it's pretty clear Xi Jinping's not stepping down at the next party Congress. Lingling, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
I completely agree with you. I would probably put the second the first reason for that. And also, just very quickly, yes, there is a sense of urgency from the central leadership. However, I'm not sure about the sense of urgency exists in the vast bureaucracy. As we know, the morale, the kind of incentives for local level officials, ministry level officials to really do stuff, are pretty, low these days, right? With all sorts of anti-corruption campaign, the kind of unexplained crackdowns on officials. So yes, the plenum document still had some very lofty goals, and if it implemented, it would really help China in various ways. But all those things were, termed as exploring fiscal reform, exploring universal healthcare for citizens, exploring this, exploring that. You know how long exploring would take, right? So there, that's why I think the party might be paving the way for the fourth term for Xi Jinping. That might be an even bigger reason for specifying that year for those goals than the urgency question.
We only have. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, just on the economic side of that, I mean, I defer mostly to you political specialists to unpack the timing there. But I just would observe that, So, okay, here we are 2024. So next third plenum, 2029, except that this is not when this third plenum is supposed to be happening. And it's supposed to be keyed to party congresses, which is not all shifting back 1 year in time, right? And so the next third plenum should actually be taking place in 2028. And so it's conceivable to me that when that happens, instead of having snarky people like Dan Rosen benchmark their progress against what they said they were going to get done within this third plenum cycle, in 2028, they'll now be able to say, well, we still have 1 year to complete everything. As we said last time, we haven't overstepped our time band to get the job done. But I don't really know whether that's too cynical a way to look at it.
No, I think that the party never fails to achieve tasks that it lays out in formal documents and guidelines. We're basically at time, and so I have 2 seconds of closing thoughts, but let me just use a minute and do a quick round robin. 20, 30 seconds to each of you. Any final thoughts, anything that you weren't able to fit into your remarks that you want to close us out? Scott?
They obviously, the party feels that it's facing huge crises or challenges domestically and internationally, and it's throwing everything in the kitchen sink at these problems. And it's going to be the party that does it. It's going to use the market and other mechanisms, but its faith is in the party, not in any other specific kinds of tools. And that sets up a huge challenge. If I think people are skeptical, and domestically there's a lot of reassurance that needs to be done, and internationally I expect greater tensions as a result of this, whether deserved or not. We're going to see a lot more tensions bilaterally and regionally and internationally, given the plan that they've described.
Great, thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks. I just wanted to flag what Dan was mentioning in terms of the tensions between China's ambitious foreign policy goals and how much capacity that China has to actually sustain it economically. I would imagine that becomes as we look forward, that could become a more problematic issue, both in terms of how much money China needs to funnel into defense, national security, but also for its foreign policy goals, and what are the trade-offs between funneling that money to those goals versus dealing with internal problems at home.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Ling Ling?
One final thought. This plenum is more about Chinese modernization than reform, as we know it. And how do you define Chinese modernization? It's basically party, state-controlled economic development.
Great. And Dan, final comment to you.
Bonnie mentioned the unified population management system, which is a very wonky little thing that was tossed into the more political sections of this. But it kind of reminds us that the ultimate litmus test of the party's ability to create a successful China is the nation's demographics. And I think that point has something to do with the demographic crisis as well. People are not getting married. They're not having children. They're not having families. If China's population is precipitously shrinking in the years ahead, then all of the baseline assumptions about growth potential shift, and there's nothing the party can really do to change that with stronger edicts or incentives or whatever. There's a 20-year lag on babies entering the workforce or more if they have to have a college education. And so this is really a really big long-term thing that nobody can sweep under the carpet.
欢迎来到6度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。 试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。